maybe.
So the fact that we don't have a presentation might even be better.
Yeah.
Because we don't have to apologize for not.
Yeah, we could always say, we didn't do a presentation because the internet sucks. We could always blame it on crappy internet. At what point do we start? It is 4 o'clock. Yeah. There's still people coming in.
Yeah. Maybe we start in 1 minute. Hey guys. Good afternoon. We're going to start in 1 minute. There are some people who are still trying to jump in, so we'll start in 1 minute.
Everybody, and then you could,
Okay.
is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. And that's 1 minute. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Fernando Diaz. This is Anna Holmes. We have a very loose structure for this conversation, which we want to have with you as well. We did not prepare a presentation because we didn't want it to fail because the internet was spotty. So we're going to talk for maybe about 30, 40 minutes on some of the, I think, key areas we think might be most helpful and are rooted in our own experience. And then we want to open it up to conversations and questions from you guys. So thanks again for being here. My name is Fernando Diaz. I'm the managing editor of Hoy Chicago, which is a daily Spanish language newspaper based here in Chicago. It's part of the Tribune Company. I also run the website, vivaloy.com, which is our website. We have a robust digital video operation, and as of 5 months ago, we launched a nightly newscast in partnership with Window Fox.
My name is Anna Holmes, and I'm editor of what's called Digital Voices at Fusion, which is a joint venture half owned by ABC and half owned by Univision, and I've only been there for about 3 months. Before that, I was a freelancer for about 4 years, and before that, I got very burnt out launching a website and running a website called Jezebel. And before that, I worked in print media, so my first foray into digital media as an editor and as a writer was started in 2007. And yeah, I've been at Fusion for about 3 months, so that's a completely new job for me.
All right, so now we're going to ask each other questions, because I'm very nervous to be sitting here in front of all of you and that really, really bright light, but also because I'm sitting next to the Anna Holmes. So we're going to talk a little bit about what audience means for us, what factors conspire toward or against content and your ability to create an audience. We do not have a secret playlist or formula that you will be able to apply in your newsroom immediately upon leaving here, so we're sorry. But we're going to try and demystify some of the things I think we've discovered in trying to build, grow, and maintain robust and engaged audiences.
It's interesting because I'm going to talk mostly about my experience working for Gawker Media, because that's the last time I really grew or expanded an audience. I mean, certainly that's what we're trying to do with Fusion, but it's a little too. I'm not far enough in the process to be able to say that one thing has worked and one thing hasn't. But I think the most important thing with regards to Gawker Media and Jezebel in particular was that, well, I was able to create an audience. Part of it was out of luck, which I know is kind of a cop-out. A lot of people don't believe in luck. But the fact that I had an idea for a site that didn't really exist at the time, and that I thought there would be an audience for. I was not certain that there was going to be an audience for it. There were people, even at the company, who expressed concern that there was going to be, or whether or not there was going to be an audience for it. I think in some ways that lit a fire under me to prove them wrong, but because nothing like it had really existed before on that scale, there was no guarantee that a women's site with the sort of sensibility that I wanted it to have was going to resonate with other people. I had to believe, though, that I wasn't the only one who wanted a site like that to exist, that I was not alone in my desire to see something different than the usual sorts of women's media, mainstream media, mostly print magazines. But at the time, a lot of the websites that were geared towards women were very much about the conspicuous consumption, like the buying of products, or the shilling of products, and a lot of them were very niche sites about things like parenthood and weddings, and things that at the time I didn't have any interest in. So I feel in some ways that my ability to grow an audience and to find an audience was because I felt ill-served myself, and then I believed that I was not alone in that. I didn't do any sort of market research. I think, actually a lot of the market research came about after the site started, and I realized that we were just one in a tradition of women's websites that were kind of, at least at the time, more on the fringe than mainstream. But I think that kind of ignorance or naivete was actually served me very well, because I wasn't trying to compare what we were doing to other people, and I wasn't trying to, I didn't feel that stressed about aping anybody else. I did start to feel stressed about people aping us a couple years into it. But I really do believe that my naivete helped focus what I wanted to do, helped the staffers focus what they wanted to do, and that our enthusiasm for what we were doing, which did feel very different at the time, was infectious and did bring in an audience that wasn't just women, but there were a fair number of men as well. So that's kind of a little bit of background into the experience at Jezebel.
Yeah, so I started at OI 4 years ago, and prior to that, my career had been in English language media, doing investigative reporting, computer-assisted reporting, daily newspapering. And so I had gone to college here in Chicago and was very familiar with OI's predecessor, which was Éxito, which was almost an all-weekly for Hispanics in Spanish. And when I got to OI, realized that we had a very, very low traffic, not a lot of local traffic, and a huge problem, both from the standpoint of what was happening with the work that was being produced at OI, and it's the ability of the business to monetize that audience and that traffic. And so very quickly, we set to one of the things that I'll talk about later, which is really appreciating our core users, and our core users, our core audience, was actually our own team. And really approaching from a content and a content production perspective first, and not starting by trying to answer, but how do we monetize? If publishing sucks, if your process sucks, you're not going to do it well, or you're not going to do it often. I had the experience of working at Chicago Now and recruiting bloggers for the Tribune's blog network, and realized that, basically the technology has come along so far that actually publishing can be very nice, very pleasurable, and you can actually learn a lot about your content. And so when I got to OI, we relaunched the site in WordPress, and immediately redistributed everyone's work roles to have a frontline access to the web. Rather than having a web team, everybody was now capable of publishing, which meant that we now had 11 more people on the web than before. What it also meant was that our audience blew up. Our audience was now coming from Nebraska and Venezuela and Mexico and Argentina and Spain, which was a huge problem because we have no correspondents and no reporters and no ad people in any of those other places. And so we sort of had this moment where, for me, the vacuum that we were trying to fill was a national and international Hispanic online voice, which I think is still a vacuum. We're a very small editorial team based in Chicago, but we realize now that our audience comes from everywhere, and folks in Chicago are wanting to know things from abroad, because our Hispanic community is very international by its nature. But then also, folks outside want to know what's going on here. And so we have this geographic advantage of actually being in the country, but also being able to see what Univision and Telemundo are doing online, and trying to sort of carve out that niche and be that voice and that place. And so far, we've grown because we've tried to occupy that vacuum.
there was definitely a demographic that I wanted to appeal to that was actually fairly broad. I mean, it was women between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 50, maybe even older. And there were readers that fell below that floor of 18 years old that I had, was not published on the site, it was just in my own head, and readers that fell a rose above the cap of, let's say, a 50-year-old. And those readers, although they were smaller in number, what's interesting to me was the element of surprise and how the unexpected audience members did shape what we did to a certain degree. And I think sometimes for better or worse, I think some of them, were grumpy and were grouchy and complained enough that we wouldn't do certain things after a while because we didn't want to deal with them. But it did feel like the larger the audience got in its makeup, and I mean both in terms of age, but also in terms of physical locale. I mean, there were a lot of people in Europe who were on the site. We could see where all the traffic was coming from, and there were usually an inordinate amount of readers coming from certainly English-speaking countries like the UK, Ireland, Australia, but also a lot of readers from Israel and Holland, and that did change our point of view a little bit. I mean, I did try and play to them a bit. We did try to do more stories that would appeal to them, but they had to also appeal to the majority American and Canadian audience. But I'm wondering whether you started changing your content at all once you started seeing an audience coming from different countries.
Yeah, we did, in the sense that we stopped, and I probably shouldn't say this when I'm like 300 feet from the mothership, but we sort of stopped focusing on local, and local for local's sake, because we realized we were never going to be able to cover it to the degree that the Chicago Tribune can, or the Sun-Times can. And so we tried to go a little bit out of our comfort zone and try to work on bigger pieces, context pieces. We use a lot of wire services, AFP, Reuters, Getty, FA. And what we realized was some of the world's best journalists work at these wire services. But if you were to go to Yahoo, you were to go to Google, well, Google does a better job now with Spotlight, but basically what you find on the top of, the main portals is, breaking news, what just happened, the day-by-day, hour-by-hour of Eric Holder, or, the airport shutdown. You don't see the sobering analysis on Ebola. You don't see a different look at immigration. These stories are in the wire services. And so what we started to do is modify our content strategy around those longer pieces, those more nuanced pieces, those perspective pieces, because we didn't see anyone else publishing them. Yeah. And so it's sort of like, okay, well, everybody can go and, find the breaking news or the celebrity news, but where do you go for depth in Spanish? Well, if you're in Colombia, you go to the main news sources in Colombia. If you're in Spain, you go to El País, or if you're in Argentina, you go to La Nación. But if you're anywhere, where do you go to find those pieces that aren't built by an organization that has a geographic tie to where they are? And so that certainly changed, because now we realized we had an opportunity to publish these pieces for the benefit of the Hispanic online community that was choosing content in Spanish. It's sort of not presupposing that our audience had to be in Chicago or our audience had to be in the United States.
Right. Yeah, one problem I always had with mainstream media that I both worked for and consumed as a consumer, and even some parts of Gawker Media, like Gawker.com, when I first began reading it, I don't know, in 2005. It was very New York-centric, and that's fun and all. I mean, I live in New York, but I am not under the illusion that New York is the center of the universe. And I felt that a lot of the media, which is produced in New York, even if it's not about New York, presupposes that New York is the center of the universe. And I always found that incredibly irritating. And what I wanted to do with our site was not to assume that our readers were all based in New York, or that they cared about New York, or that they cared about any of the things that we cared about on that kind of more granular level, like what bars are hot, or what designer is sought after. That we had things in common that transcended city and state and even national boundaries. So to me, I do think that sometimes the idea of expanding an audience or growing an audience, some people take the the tactic of throwing shit against the wall to see what sticks, or trying to feel like they have to appeal to a large group or everybody, and that's the way to do it. I think there might be some truth in the idea of moving beyond or out of your own bubble. In our case, moving outside of the New York media incestuousness, because all of the people that I hired at first were all living in New York, as was I. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that the audience is global, and also not to try to appeal to everybody. I mean, quite honestly, I didn't care whether men read the site. I was pleasantly surprised when we got the demographics, and I'm still not sure how much I believe that they were true, because we were told that 20% of the readership was male, which I find a bit high. But I did not care whether men read the site. That's not because I dislike men. I just didn't want to care. That was very, very low on my list of things that are important. I wanted to speak to a female readership. The fact that men did read it and that they found something great about the site, and sometimes infuriating, was a nice surprise. But at the same time, we had a very particular point of view, and we had very particular politics, which I also wasn't going to apologize for. So during the 2008 election, there had been some questions coming from people above me as to whether our readers cared about politics, and I felt like that was a no-brainer. Of course they do. And we did a fairly robust coverage of the 2008 election. Coverage, I wasn't sending reporters to DC, but there was a lot of commentary about the primaries and then the general election. And the readers loved it, and they engaged in the comments in a way that I hadn't seen before, and they'd been pretty engaged before that. But I got a number of emails over the summer of 2008 and into the fall from readers who asked me or demanded to know why we didn't have a Republican point of view on the site, because most of the posts about the Republican candidate and his running mate were negative. And my opinion was that you could go somewhere else and find glowing profiles of John McCain or Sarah Palin, and that they did not represent what we wanted in our next president or vice president, and that we had a very particular point of view that was very biased, and I was not going to apologize for it. And so, the idea that might turn off potential readers I don't think it didn't matter so much to me, because what mattered was being consistent in our message, and our sensibility was one that I would describe as on the liberal side, and there were certain political issues we were going to take a stand on and not give equal time to the other side. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think it's as important to try to appeal to an audience as to not care about the audiences that you're not going to appeal to try not to be everything to everybody.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've had a lot of conversations, some stupid, some appropriate, about whether we should publish in English. And I think, at least at the outset, This Is Fusion was predicated upon that we must, or else we will die with our first-generation Spanish-dominant newspaper readers. And I think the easy approach would have been, let's do both. The reality is that our team is built as a Spanish-language newsroom, and so that, I think it's about speaking to your advantage, or speaking to your passion, or speaking to that subject that you really can manage. One of the downsides is you're not going to hit everybody, and one of the things that we often battle is the fact that, we're in Spanish, and when we do publish something that's interesting or relevant outside of the Hispanic community in Chicago, most people can't read it.
Most English-speaking people can't.
So it's sort of like you have to break a story big enough to get it in English. You have to break a story that's big enough for the rest of the audience to care, or we have to translate and make that story available. But again, that means then that we're moving from, I guess, currently what is our core audience, and we don't have the bandwidth to then be all things to all people.
Do you see audience spikes when you do have those stories that get translated into English and that?
No. Not at all.
You don't see like an ongoing kind of...
No, it's our stories, I would say, follow the general contours of national and international news. What we have found is when we try to do different types of stories, or we try to do, polls and quizzes. All of these are now, I feel like the Spanish language internet is not where the English language internet is. There's no Reddit en Español. I know there's a subreddit, but it's horribly underutilized. And so it's sort of like, where are all the Spanish language Redditors on the internet if they're not? Oh, well, they're probably on Reddit in English because a meme is a meme. And so you're starting to see a little bit of that development, especially now with the World Cup. There was a huge new universe of memes for the Hispanic community. But moving into those places has meant now that we have to try and create a different kind of content, or it's not even a different kind of content, it's a different type of site. And so now we're facing the, are we a newspaper that has a website that's on the internet in Spanish and is growing, turning into English, or is growing, turning into other sites that service internet users in different ways than a newspaper.com? And I think that's also something that all of us need to consider is, do you want to ape somebody else, or do you want to imitate somebody else, or do you ultimately go out and try to become what your audience is telling you need to be? And I think we battle with that every day.
Do you ever feel like that it's a zero-sum game? Meaning, one anecdote I can use, and I kind of alluded to earlier, was our site started and it became successful, and we were thrilled about that. But then other sites started launching that were pretty much, I wouldn't say they were copycats. They all had their own kind of sensibility, but they were obviously influenced by the success of our site. And I think that my first reaction when that began to happen was to become very rigid and get really, really, really competitive. And I really believe that there wasn't enough room for more than one women's site appealing to a certain demographic with a certain sensibility, which is not true. But I'm curious to know whether you think that your Spanish language competitors are in competition with you. If as they grow, you grow.
Yeah.
If you're creating a genre, for lack of a better word, along with a lot of these other publishers and editors, or whether you're in competition with one another.
I think we're so small as to not matter, honestly. I think, we're not going to compete with Univision, unfortunately. We might compete on a story. We might break a story that they're not getting to. The way I've tried to describe it to the folks on our team is to think that we're the Marco Polos going to the English language internet to build a better Spanish language internet. And so we just relaunched our site, and it's heavily inspired by Medium. Because most of the Spanish language news sites look like 2004, right? So, but there's no Medium en Español, right? Unless we build it, right? Or unless Medium decides that they're going to now start publishing a whole section of their site in Spanish. And so we don't necessarily consider other Hispanic publishers or content providers as our competition, as much as just trying to benchmark ourselves for where we fit, right? And if we can fit because we're faster, because we're prettier, because our content is better, whether it comes from us or it comes from one of our content providers, we feel like we're doing the best we can. And in that sense, doing right by our audience. We're not trying to fake. We're not trying to stunt. We're literally trying to do the absolute best job we can, given what we've got.
I'm curious to know about people's experiences with internet commenters, because my experience with internet commenters is I have a love-hate relationship with them. I don't know if they occupy the same positions of power that I felt that they used to, at least with our site. They were quite powerful. They were very numerous in number. They were very loyal. They sat on the site all day long, refreshing it, and had a lot to say. And a lot of what they had to say influenced what we wrote about, and I think helped expand our audience because we were listening to them. We were paying attention to the commenters. I think in some news organizations that's impossible because the comments are not moderated, or there isn't enough manpower in order to moderate those comments, and so you have to wade through a lot of crap. We kind of had a self-policing commenter community, as well as volunteer moderators, as well as myself and other staffers who would go through them. And yes, we got irritated a lot of the time, and my blood pressure rose, and I would give the finger to my computer screen quite a bit. But I felt like they were helping to sometimes shape our coverage of things, but also to give us new ideas. If there were conversations happening in the comments that would give us story ideas, and we would usually give the commenter credit for it, but that was actually a really productive way of expanding our audience, because they would bring up issues that we hadn't considered before, or they had certain amounts of expertise that we didn't have collectively. And when we began to listen to them more seriously, and began to kind of, I wouldn't say that all of our coverage was affected by what they were saying, but I'd say a good 30 to 40% of it was. Mm-hmm. We saw our audience grow there, because not only did they know that we were listening to them, and not only did they feel respected and heard, but when we would kind of dig into a certain angle of a certain subject that one of them had brought up, that would bring other people in who were interested in that as well. So I'm curious to know about your experience with commenters.
For us, so we just relaunched and we turned comments off, partly because I think we, the folks who choose to comment on our site are doing in all caps and off topic, and so I think we're still trying to figure out, again, going to that earlier point about, are we a site that publishes news and you comment at the bottom, or is there an opportunity for a site where it's all comments? And the conversation is there. For those of you who are not from Chicago or familiar with Curious City, which is an amazing project that's been going on for about a year, it's based on questions from the audience. And so that's something that it's sort of like we don't just want to default, put them on the bottom. We'd rather experiment some more or think about it some more before actually just defaulting to that. We've found that the best, sort of that 1 or 10%, depending on how you're counting your most engaged user base, oftentimes wants more than commenting, right? They want access. They want to talk to you, right? They don't want to just be smart at the bottom of the story. They want to post on the site as legitimate content, right? Not as the appendage. And so that's part of what's moving us to establish or try to grow a contributor network, to say, well, we really don't want 1,000 comments on a story. We want 10 great new posts by 10 new people. The key, and this is where earlier I was asking you about Kinja, is how do you potentially leverage that comment area as the filter to identify those voices, to then give them sort of super access to the platform, right? And put them on your level or on the level of the people that work for you, and so that it's not just them at the bottom of the story, posting for posterity as much as them really actively contributing in a much more profound way to the culture of the site. That's something that we're still grappling with. I'm a huge fan of Hacker News and USV, and how oftentimes, and this is I think a part that we have to figure out how to calculate, is oftentimes the conversation is not actually happening on your site. It's not in the comments. It's on another site, or it's on somebody else's Facebook page. And then how do you actually figure out the true impact or the best conversation that you've motivated with your content when the conversations are happening in so many different places? Again, going back to trying to figure out what site we want to be, is do we want to be that site? A place where everybody comes to talk about everybody else's content. I mean, that's Reddit, and Reddit is ugly as hell, but it works. And so that's a dynamic, I think, that responds to a type of internet user. And at this point, we're trying to transition from folks who come to read to folks who want to engage. And I think we have a ways to go.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the quality control. I mean, in theory, I like the idea of people being given the tools to publish what they want on your platform. And you just mentioned Kinja, which is the CMS that Gawker Media uses, but I never used it. When I was there, it was not around. And I feel somewhat blessed for that, because from what I hear, it's very irritating. But the idea behind Kinja is that readers of Gawker Media sites can create their own subblogs and post their own things, and that they don't have to. They can use burner accounts. They don't have to be approved as commenters. then what you have happen is what you had happen to the site I used to run, which is that it got overtaken by trolls who were posting violent imagery in the comments, and upsetting not just the readers but the editors, and making it very difficult for them to do their job. So I always feel a little bit nervous about handing the keys over to readers, because I want them to be engaged, but I also think that sometimes they can exhibit a sense of entitlement that I don't personally enjoy. But let's talk about social media, because I want to, when I was running Jezebel, Twitter existed and so did Facebook, but they had no power. They had nothing close to the power they have now.
Yeah.
I did not care about social media. I didn't have to care about social media. I looked at it sometimes, but it wasn't a place where I got my news. I used an RSS feed. It wasn't a place where I felt compelled to promote our stuff, and our audience was not growing because of Facebook or Twitter. It was growing because of, I think we had good content, and people were sharing stuff via email or putting on their Facebook page, but not in the ways that they are now.
Yeah.
It didn't have the sort of primacy of importance that it does now. So I'm curious to know how you use social media.
We use it sparingly, because we're trying to establish our identity. And so everyone on our team has access to all of our social media accounts. But social is not the focus as much as the content and the process of building the content. Because we just relaunched, we're really excited to see how people end up sharing our stuff rather than us trying to create mega accounts. We had this awesome, I had this awesome experience on Tuesday. We published an Argentinian junior undergraduate student in journalism was writing about the future of boxing, and whether it's going to be Mexican or not. And because Mayweather's going to retire, and it's not going to be Pacquiao Mayweather, and so the next crop may be Mexicans. And he's Argentinian, but there are Argentinian boxers who are really important and really relevant, and so what is the future of boxing? And when I was at Chicago Now, which also was 5 years ago, the premise was, well, you blog for us and we'll pay you for local traffic, right? Well, pay you for local traffic is not enough for the content, right? The energy, the passion that you put into that content. So automatically we monetized. We made the content worth whatever we were willing to pay for it, which was nothing, right? As opposed to publishing somebody's very legitimate content. So as we're now embarking on this new, bringing people on and having them use our platform, we're not having that conversation around money. And so this young man published his story on our platform and screen grabbed his story and made it his Twitter wallpaper, which was awesome, because I never would have imagined that would happen. And so now anybody who goes to his Twitter account is seeing our site. We're seeing his clip, if you will. And so we're trying to figure out how to engage people on their, again, on a one-to-one level. I don't necessarily want 50,000 followers on Twitter. I want to be able to have relationships with people via social media that's about the content. The reality is, unless I go to Argentina or he comes to visit, we're never going to meet, right? And so we're probably never going to become intimate pals, right? But I'm incredibly grateful that he contributed that content to us. It was awesome. I'm also incredibly grateful that he is advertising our site to anybody who comes to visit his Twitter account. Now, it's sort of like, would I prefer that he had 1 million followers on Twitter and retweeted a link to our stuff? Maybe. But I'm really grateful that this kid with 300 followers in Argentina, who is a student, did this, and that to me is more valuable than trying to hunt down the whales that are gonna, create some viral, make our month because now we got to X page views, which don't matter next month,
Right.
But the relationship that we have, like, he's got a mom, he's got a dad, he's got friends who are all gonna see his stuff. So now we've legitimized his perspective, his point of view, and his ability to actually publish. And so I'm hoping that that's the pay it forward, that there's going to be other people who are like, hey, you published my buddy, or hey, I've seen what you've done. I'd really like to participate too. And that's why I feel like having that kind of conversation rather than, where do we put the comments, is more valuable, because there's still a lot of work in identifying those people and attracting those people.
I have a lot of respect for people who do audience development, even though I don't understand what they do. I mean, I kind of understand what they do, but there are a lot of positions in some media companies that didn't exist even 4 or 5 years ago, or at least didn't exist in the numbers that they exist now, that are all about growing audiences. And I respect what they do. I don't always understand what they do, but I always come back to the same thing, which is that I think the way to grow an audience is to, fill a niche that you think is not being filled, or with a point of view or a sensibility, to create good content, and that hopefully the rest will come. And maybe that is totally naive of me, but I really do believe that readers pick up on the excitement of content creators when they love their jobs, when they care about what they're writing and about and editing. That it comes through the screen. The internet is a difficult place to navigate. I think it can be a very cold place, but I do believe that readership picks up on the enthusiasm of content creators, and that's the sort of thing that will eventually drive traffic instead of trying to game things with SEO or with Upworthy style headlines that clickbait sort of stuff. Just good content is what tends to get shared, and so I always come back to that. I don't think there's any kind of magic way to grow an audience other than to be patient and to do very good work and to work very hard.
And it resonates or it doesn't. Sure. And because it doesn't resonate doesn't mean you failed as a writer or as a content creator. It just means, maybe it didn't work or it didn't find its audience. I agree 100% with what you just said, except one part, which is hope. You don't need hope anymore because you have analytics. And so at that point, it's a matter of being very robust in measuring. How far did this piece go? Who was reading it, on what? How long did they read it for? What did they do with it? We did a top-down, tried to figure out, we have Chartbeat, Omniture, and Google Analytics on our site. And we did a top-down analysis to try and figure out every single metric we could calculate. And we discovered that the majority of our mobile users were on iPhone 3Gs in 2014, almost 2015, right? To the point where the next question we wanted to ask was, well, where the hell are they, right? Because iPhones are not prevalent in Latin America, right? So are they iPhone 3G users in the US? If so, we need to make a blazing fast site, right? Because 3G sucks. Yeah. But also, where are these people? And that was the end of our analytics quest. So now we have to find how to customize our Google dashboard so we can see if there's a geographic component to that 3G universe. And then we're now down a rabbit hole on, well, is there twice as many people who have iPhone 3Gs, and are those the people that we want to reach? But you can measure everything, and you should be measuring everything, not because you want to rule your life by, I suck this month because my traffic is down, but because over time you'll get a sense for what works. And I think that what you were describing about being passionate and creating content you care about, I imagine that almost everyone, if not everyone in this room, has had the experience of something they published a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, or 10 years ago, is still getting traffic, right? That to me is success. And that to me is not because you stunted, or you gamed social media, but because at some point in time you created something very valuable and it's still there. And so that's why I would say, yes, hope to a degree, but you can always measure to get a sense of how you're doing.
I like analytics, but I also don't always think of analytics as being and I'm not saying you said this, but the end-all be-all. For example, there were many posts or stories I've done that I know are not going to get a lot of traffic. And I know that going in, and I don't care, because the fact that the story was done says something to the readership. If they see that headline, they don't have to click through, they don't have to read it, but it communicates something about what the news organization deems important, and that communicates something about who we are. And so, oftentimes I would purposely assign stories that I knew were not going to get a lot of of attention, because I wanted to reinforce among the readership what we deemed important, what we felt was important, alongside, the more obvious traffic generators. And it was sometimes difficult because I would have staffers who were tasked with, let's say, covering celebrity culture, which always got, those posts got clicked on all the time. And then if I had a staffer who was tasked with covering a tight Senate race, that was going to get maybe 1/5 of the traffic of the post about Kim Kardashian. It didn't matter though, to me, because it still communicated to everybody who was on the site that the Senate race matters, whether or not they decided to read it. Right. And I also felt that the repetition of that, of continuing to do content that did not get a lot of traffic, did eventually seep into, or that we did eventually get to some of the people who might have been resistant to it. Yeah. That by seeing it over and over and over again, their interest might have been activated, and maybe they would click on a few stories and learn something. So I do think analytics are important, but I don't think that one's content should be only predicated on what you think is going to get the most traffic. I think a lot of it is communicating to people what's important, which is why I still like the front page of a newspaper. Or I guess maybe even the homepage of a newspaper. It communicates what, let's say, the Times editors think is the most important thing in the world that day. I may not agree with them, but at least I have a sense of where they're coming from in a way that I don't have when I see one of their headlines pop up on Twitter.
Yeah. And that's why I like the inside pages of an actual newspaper, because it's sort of like, oh, we cared enough to put it in, but not enough to put it at the top. So please go chase this, because it's a story. Yeah. We are at 4:42. Want to make plenty of time for questions. Do you want to make one last point before we open it up?
I think I made my last point.
Okay, yeah. Awesome. Well, I would just, we are blessed at OI after 4 years of trying to have hired 2 developers in our newsroom, which is, for me, a huge coup. It's the first developers in a Spanish language newsroom in this country. And it really, if you have developers in your departments, in your newsrooms, on your floor, in the basement, make friends, make friends, make friends, because those folks can help what I would consider to be my main point, which is to hack your process, to really take a look at your day in, day out process and make it better. Again, you're going to be making the lives of the people who are the core constituency better, and that's only going to make your site better. It also means you potentially could spend less with vendors, right? Because you're not, oh, we have to go buy this polling app and bolt it onto our site and make it look almost like what it's supposed to look like. You can actually build things that respond to your audience's interests. So that would be my last point, and we would love to hear your questions, if you have any. We so hope you do.
The microphone.
Yeah, the microphone is right in the middle.
Hi, my name is Jen McMillan. I'm the managing editor of news at Huffington Post Canada. And I was really interested in what you were talking about, Anna, with the sort of the presidential election. Like, obviously, you both have sites that cater to a specific audience, and you know your audience, but you're covering this topic, this issue that everyone in the world is covering, right? So how do you develop that strategy for covering a big issue for your audience, and also talking to your staff about, we're not doing what everybody else is doing here, we're doing something that's unique to our audience and what we do?
That's an interesting question, because I think it also goes back to my feelings about growing audiences in general, or working in media, which is that I try and go by my intuition, which doesn't sound that compelling. I mean, it'd be much sexier if I had a strategy with like a PowerPoint, and this is you do A, B, and C. But I just kind of go with my intuition, and sometimes it's wrong. But in that case, it was kind of trial and error. With the presidential election, there were tons of other outlets covering it. I wanted to have a specific point of view, and luckily it was a very interesting election. There was Hillary Clinton, so there was a gender angle. We had Barack Obama, there was a racial angle. Then Sarah Palin came along, and there was a crazy angle. and I felt like, like that was like the perfect election for us to be our first. I couldn't have scripted it any better. But on a day-to-day basis, there are tons of DC reporting outlets that are reporting every little movement in the polls, or so and so said this and so said that, and we would try and touch on those when it felt relevant. But if there was something that was happening in the election that had to do with one of those three things, the gender angle, the racial angle, or the crazy angle, then we would be all over it. So that's what felt most compelling to me, and that's what seemed to feel most compelling to the readers. But it's hard for me to say whether that felt most compelling to the readers because I was forcing it on them. If we decided to devote a lot of virtual ink to Joe Biden, maybe they would suddenly have started to care about Joe Biden, but Joe Biden wasn't really interesting to me. So a lot of it was just intuitive. And I think that I've learned to trust my intuition. I don't always trust it, but in that case, it just felt like those were the points he wanted to hammer home. And of course, it wasn't just about Hillary being the potential first female president. It was about the ways that she was discussed in the media. It was about the things that John McCain said about women or women's health. It was about the things that Barack Obama said about women or women's health. It was about Mr. Obama's wife and what she symbolized to the country. I mean, there was just so much richness there for us to mine that it felt like we were never without content. But we weren't doing regular posts about Frank Luntz, the pollster, or we weren't doing particularly wonky things, or if we did do wonky things, it would be like in a bulleted list in the morning, like here's the updates on what's happening with the election. But it was very intuitive, and so I think with the big stories, that's the way that I operated, and I think sometimes we didn't always get them right. I'm trying to think of an example of another story where I feel like we took the wrong tactic or we ignored it altogether, and one will come to me, but I purposely forgot a lot of this. It was a very demanding job.
Well, and I think that the point is also that you don't have to be always right. Mm-hmm. You can bat 300 and get into the Hall of Fame. So for us, it's always an either or, almost never an and. And so you sort of have to trust your gut, you have to trust your experience, and you have to make that decision. The way we look at our wire services is we look at them as this legion of journalists distributed all over the globe that don't work for us, but do. And so we'll tend to lean on them for breaking, for the sort of the pack stories, and then we'll try to focus ourselves on original pieces. And so that way we're never duplicating what's already being done, because then that means there's not one other angle. And so that's part of our intuition, is to just always try to default to that. See what's available. If it's out there, work with it and go the other way rather than immediately go to the obvious pack story.
Yeah, I think there's some cases in which something I might have found it interesting enough to share with our readers, but it was not interesting enough to weigh in on any further. I mean, we would literally put one sentence on the site with a link, and that was all that was really needed. And sometimes that thing was comedic and funny, and sometimes there was a tragedy somewhere that we felt we should acknowledge, but there was nothing more to say. But like the idea of trusting your gut, I think, is very important. It sounds like a cliche, but when you're working in a very fast-paced online news organization or media organization, that's all you really have, which is a great way to learn to trust your gut, is to be constantly under pressure and feeling like you have to put up a new post every 10 minutes. That's a great way to be able to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Right.
Hi.
Hi. So did you all ever have points where you had a story that you felt like was kind of in your wheelhouse, but it was just too far in the weeds to really be worth putting energy into? Like it was just too specialized or just too particular that just wouldn't be enough of an audience there to justify doing the posts? And what was the kind of the thing that made you decide that? Like what was the deciding factor there?
Can I take the first stab?
Yeah.
So this is a story. It's still a story because we haven't done it. Please do it. It's important. And the reason why we haven't done it is because we acknowledged that we did not have the resources to do it properly. We were fortunate enough to have two of our journalists participate in the Dennis Hunt Health Fund for Journalism, which are the Fund for Health Journalism, which is based out of California. And we did 2 years worth of stories on migrant working children and children who basically migrate from Texas all the way up to Illinois to work in the cornfields. And along in the second year of reporting that story, we discovered that there was a database called M6. And this database was a relic of No Child Left Behind and purported to track educational outcomes for migrant working children, so that if you are following harvests, you could conceivably still graduate on time, right? So you could take 3 weeks of English in Illinois, and then when you move to Michigan, you get another 3 weeks. So this database was set up with federal dollars to essentially provide a base for tracking those outcomes and ensuring that kids were actually learning, right? Migrant workers, it's a generational industry, and in many cases it's because of a lack of, real educational support, a support system. We knew we couldn't pull that off. Like, we could see it. We knew it, it was right there, we just couldn't pull it off. And so we had to back off, and that's why I'm talking about it in public, right? Because it was sort of like, we knew that if we did that story, we wouldn't do the story the justice that it needed to get to where it would go, regardless of, to Anna's point, regardless of whether it was going to be a, listicle on, what kind of harvest would you pick if you were a migrant worker, So I think that's the key too, is just know your limits, and it sucks, it hurts, but, eventually you get to a point where you find your speed and you're able to do pieces that you're comfortable with.
I think my answer to that question is that at the time that I worked for Gawker Media, they weren't exactly giving us a lot of financial resources to do deeply reported things. So there were plenty of things that we didn't end up doing because I didn't have the literal money, and I also didn't have the staff. I couldn't allow the staff that was there to take even a day off, for the most part, to report something. I mean, I wanted it was a different era, and it was a blog, and it was just a fast-paced blog, and they had to work 8 hours a day and do 10 posts, and that was really what we had to do. I mean, there were some larger stories that we would work on for longer periods of time, but I didn't have the luxury for the most part. But one story that I didn't do that didn't feel right for us, that I gave to somebody else, was I don't know if this was the summer, maybe the summer of 2007, maybe 2008, maybe 2009. When a female reader, sent me something that she'd found on the beach in Montauk, Long Island, a picture which was a horrible-looking creature. I don't know what it was. It was something bloated and dead and didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. And she said that she found it on the beach in Montauk, and I was horrified. But it's like, what does that have to do with Jezebel? I mean, other than the fact that it was sent by a woman, that wasn't enough of a reason. So I gave it to Gawker, and then they put it up and they called it the Montauk Monster, and I got 2 million page views, and made the person who posted it briefly somewhat wealthy, but because we had page view bonuses. So I didn't know it was going to blow up like that, and it was all over the news, and I kept thinking we should have just posted it. But there was no reason that I still couldn't figure out a way I could have spun that would have made sense to appear on that site. So yeah. I'm glad that I didn't. I'm glad I gave it away. But I had no idea it was going to blow up like that. And yeah, it would have made me look good in the eyes of my boss, and we would have gotten bonuses. But in the end, it was not on target. It was I don't know what it ended up being. I don't know when they ended up figuring out that thing was. I don't think it was a dog, but it was something. It was bad. So that's kind of an answer, but that again, I don't really regret it. I just felt like there were sometimes I had to make calls about stories that I knew would do very well. Not in that case, because I didn't know, but stories I knew would do very well that just didn't. It would just be obvious that we were trying to get traffic, and there was one thing I didn't like, and I didn't like being called out on being cheap, or like using cheap. Yeah, I hated that because they were right. So, hi.
Hi. My name is Ashley, and I have one of those audience development jobs at the Detroit Free Press. And, this is really interesting, but I was wondering if you guys have an experience with serving two distinctly different audiences. I feel like our digital audience, or the person that I'm trying to reach, they're like me. They're probably urban, they're under the age of 40, they're like really interested in the story of Detroit's comeback, and they want to be part of that and read those stories. But I don't want to totally overgeneralize, but our print demographic is definitely skews older and more suburban and is less interested in that. And I feel like we're constantly having to choose between which audience we serve because we only have so many people, to write the stories. Did you ever have, obviously you don't have the print and digital issue, but did you ever feel like you had two different audiences you had to choose between?
Is that just for Anna, or can I answer too?
Oh, for either of you,
Oh,
please.
okay. Because we do have print.
Okay.
And so, literally, it's a schizophrenic reality, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like our Scarborough says that our print audience is a first-generation Spanish language dominant, likely married, maybe high school audience, immigrated from Mexico, probably Michoacan, wants to know what's going on in Mexico, and that's our print audience, and that's who pays the bills. Now, we also have this digital monster that is not that audience in any way, shape, or form. And so this may sound like a cop-out, but it's focus on the story. There is a story that's going to resonate with you and with your older print reader because it's a story, rather than because it speaks to your lifestyle or it speaks to your socioeconomic state. We were talking earlier about the efforts that are underway now to reach Hispanic millennials. Hispanic millennials hate being called Hispanic millennials.
I was talking about Fusion,
Yeah.
which when it first launched was really geared towards appealing to Hispanic millennials, and then they realized that they didn't want to be referred to as Hispanic millennials. They're
Right.
just Actually, they don't want to be referred to as millennials either. And I don't like that word, but they're
Yeah.
just young adults.
So I think it's a matter of, I don't think it's wise to partition your content strategy that way, right? Obviously, there are people in the print edition who are going to be at a different life stage than you are, but I think the organizations that we work in are still very story driven, at least on the editorial side, and there are ways for those to resonate across both platforms, regardless of, I'm reading it on the train on my phone in the morning, or I'm reading it in my, kitchen on the coffee table with my, all spread out on the table. You have no option, right? It's sort of like they were never going to hire a digital team for us, and so we just had to make it work.
We had a couple of different audiences, but I don't think in the more profound ways that Fernando just described. We had the audience of young women who wanted to read somewhat snarky stuff about celebrity culture. Then we had an audience of women who were very concerned about gender politics, and wanted to approach every issue from a feminist lens, which we encouraged, but oftentimes we didn't do it. We weren't. They didn't believe in our legitimacy. So there were people who were there just to watch other people fight with one another. I mean, it felt like we had a number of audiences that we had to, well, I don't know that we had to serve them all, but who existed and who were often in conflict with one another and with us. And the only thing we could do was continue doing what we were doing. But it wasn't as stark as, I don't think that there were that many demographic differences. It was mostly ideological differences, which could get very heated.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
Danielle Renwick from the Council on Foreign Relations. My question, I guess, is mostly about Fusion, and I was just curious, what percentage of your audience are actually Hispanic, or what percentage is just general population? And what really draws me to Fusion is its coverage of Latin
Is
America.
what?
Oh, what really draws me to Fusion is its coverage of Latin American politics, and I'm wondering how much is that sort of the vegetables or the stories that you want your audience to know is valuable to you, or to what extent is there a demand for that content?
I have no idea what percentage of the audience is Hispanic, and that's a great question that I don't know the answer to. We're in the midst of basically redoing a lot of our web presence. I don't run the website. I do stuff that will appear on the website, but it is more project-based. It isn't news stories. It isn't aggregation or blogging, so to speak. I don't know if our editor is in the audience. She said she was going to come, but I don't see her anywhere here. But so I'm not sure about the demographics. But you know, the great thing that we've been told repeatedly by the higher ups at Fusion is that they want us to do stories about serious issues and have a global point of view, which is to say not just concentrate on the United States. Fusion is based in Miami, which is fascinating to me because most organizations of that size are based in another city like Boston or DC or New York, in some cases San Francisco. So it's very much within its DNA that it has an interest in issues that are not only occurring within the borders of the continental United States. And that's some of what drew me to it, because I think my continued frustration with some media is that it still is very homogenous, that it doesn't see beyond U.S. borders unless it has something to do with terrorism or war, that it is very white and very male, and you know, Fusion really felt like a truly 21st century, feels like a very truly 21st century media company. And I like the idea of trying to appeal to young adults, because the older I get, I feel like that might be becoming more difficult. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, it's 5:02. We are very grateful for your participation and attendance, and we'll stick around.
Thank you.